My name is Erin Wallace. I'm 37 years old, and the last place I expected my life to splinter was at my parents' dining table. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. But somewhere between the clinking silverware and the uneasy politeness, the air shifted. Sharp, unmistakable. And then it happened. My sister leaned back in her chair, looked straight at me, and said the kind of sentence that doesn't just bruise, it cuts. "You're a burden. We want to live without you." I didn't react. Not outwardly. What stunned me wasn't even her words. It was the quiet agreement hanging in the room. My mother smiled faintly, lifted her glass of wine, and took a slow sip as if the remark were harmless, as if it had nothing to do with me. My father kept his eyes on his plate, refusing to lift his head. I sat there, feeling every year I had carried that household pressed down on me like a weight no one else could see. It didn't matter. No one at that table wanted the truth anyway. So I stood up. No dramatic exit, no trembling voice, just a quiet decision. I walked out of the house, out into the night, without taking a single look back. The next morning, I woke up on a friend's couch to 38 missed calls from family. 38. All from the people who hours earlier claimed they didn't want me around. What they didn't know was that my absence came with consequences, and by the time they realized it, it was already far too late. Before I tell you what they said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. In the years leading up to that moment, my life had followed a path I never thought I would abandon. I had built something solid in Seattle, a modest bookkeeping company that carried my name and reflected every late night I spent learning how to keep small businesses afloat. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching clients trust me with their numbers, their fears, and the fragile margins that kept them open. For a while, that world felt like my own version of stability. Then the phone rang one afternoon, pulling me out of a spreadsheet and into a reality I wasn't prepared for. Harold Wallace, my father, had collapsed the week before, and the medical bills were rising faster than my family could manage. My mother, Susan Wallace, tried to sound calm, but the strain in her voice slipped through every carefully chosen word. Their mortgage had also slipped into dangerous territory, weighed down by months of partial payments and a roof that needed more attention than they could afford. The house in Colorado Springs, the place I grew up in, was on the edge of becoming another number on a lender's list. I didn't hesitate. That part still surprises me when I look back. I had worked years to bring my company to life, but the idea of losing my family home pushed everything else aside. Within a month, I signed the documents that transferred ownership of my business for a sum that barely reflected its worth, $150,000, enough to clear the most urgent debts and give them a little space to breathe. I moved out of my apartment, packed my belongings into a few boxes, and drove east toward the mountains I thought I had left behind for good. When I arrived, the house looked almost exactly as I remembered it, but the atmosphere inside had changed. Bills filled the kitchen counter. Notices from the mortgage company were tucked beneath a stack of coupons. My mother tried to downplay it, brushing her hand across the envelopes as though they were harmless, but her eyes gave everything away. My father stayed in his recliner most afternoons, recovering slowly, doing his best not to add to the tension. My younger sister, Kelly Wallace, greeted me with polite relief at first. She had been between jobs for a while, stitching together small freelance marketing projects that relied heavily on stable internet access. I didn't mind covering the cost. I didn't mind covering anything, really. I told myself this was temporary, that once the medical bills were gone and their mortgage was caught up, I would return to Seattle and rebuild what I had sacrificed. But temporary stretched into seasons, and seasons into years. One by one, each household expense migrated into my name: electricity, water, insurance, property taxes. At first, I kept careful track of every payment, believing it would help me decide when it was time to step away. Eventually, I stopped checking. The responsibility became routine, another part of the life I was trying to keep from falling apart. I found a position at a local building supply store doing basic accounting work. The pay was less than I once made, but it was steady, and I needed steady more than pride. I told myself it was fine, that supporting them mattered more than any ambition I had left in Seattle. Kelly continued taking on digital work when she could, but nothing consistent appeared, and the balance of the house seemed to rest more and more on my income. The quiet pressure of those years settled into my bones in ways I didn't recognize until much later. I rarely thought about the business I had sold or the clients I had left behind, but when I did, the ache was sharp. None of that changed the fact that they needed me. Or at least, that was what I believed every time I wrote another check or updated another automatic payment. I held on to the idea that my presence was helping, that my sacrifice had value. I didn't realize how fragile that belief truly was until the day everything unraveled. There came a point when the rhythm inside that house shifted in ways I couldn't ignore. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to a new arrangement I hadn't agreed to. Over time, the change settled into something firmer, a pattern I recognized only when it became impossible to rationalize. Kelly Wallace had always been the kind of person who filled a room quickly. Her confidence arrived before she did, and most days she appeared certain the world should adjust to her pace. I used to admire that about her when we were younger, but adulthood had sharpened her edges. As the months stretched into years, she treated me less like the sister who had shared childhood bedrooms and more like an inconvenient presence taking up space she believed belonged to her. Her moods fluctuated depending on whether she had secured a new freelance project. When things were going well, she moved lightly through the day, humming under her breath as she prepared her work area. When clients disappeared or deadlines piled up, the atmosphere around her grew dense, carrying a tension that seeped through the house. I often adjusted myself around her restlessness, hoping to avoid confrontation I never asked for. The subtle dismissals arrived first. A pointed glance when I walked into a room. A sigh when she opened the refrigerator I had stocked. A roll of her eyes whenever I sat at the table with my laptop. None of it loud enough to challenge directly, but persistent enough to make me question whether I had overstayed a welcome that was supposed to be temporary. Susan Wallace, my mother, saw the shifts but never addressed them. Her instinct had always been to diffuse discomfort rather than confront it. If Kelly made a comment that bordered on disrespect, Susan found a way to smooth the edges, telling herself, and me, that stress made people say things they didn't fully mean. She moved through the house as though maintaining calm counted more than acknowledging the tension building beneath the surface. My father, Harold Wallace, retreated into the routine that felt safest for him. Recovering from his health issues had given him an excuse to keep his distance from conflict. He spent hours in the garage sorting tools, repairing whatever neighbors brought by, and pretending not to notice the fractures forming within the household. His silence wasn't malicious, but it created a vacuum where fairness might have lived. The burden of maintaining stability settled on me. Every bill I paid was absorbed into the background of the home, unnoticed unless something went wrong. Whenever a payment processed late or a subscription renewal appeared unexpectedly, Kelly reacted as if the inconvenience had been designed to disrupt her life specifically. She ignored the reality that I was the only reason the services functioned at all. Gradually, the dynamic shifted from quiet dependence to unspoken expectation. Kelly treated the household utilities as though they existed naturally, unconnected to the hours I worked at the building supply store. Susan thanked me occasionally, but the gratitude dissolved quickly, replaced by assumptions that I could cover whatever financial gap emerged next. The more I provided, the less visible my contribution became. It didn't escape the attention of Paula King, the neighbor who often dropped by with gardening supplies or bits of local news. She noticed the imbalance long before I admitted it to myself. Whenever she glimpsed the tension between Kelly and me, her expression tightened slightly, as if she wanted to say something but knew it wasn't her place. Her husband, Derek King, kept his observations to himself, offering only polite nods when our paths crossed. The longer I stayed, the clearer it became that the household had reorganized itself with me as a silent pillar supporting everything from behind the scenes. No one acknowledged how heavily they leaned on me, and no one seemed interested in considering how unsustainable that role had become. There was nothing dramatic about the realization. It arrived slowly, like a quiet understanding settling in after years of looking away. I began to recognize that the balance in our home had tipped far beyond what I could carry. I didn't know yet what that would mean for me, only that something fundamental had shifted irreversibly. By the time everything inside me finally cracked open, I found myself standing in unfamiliar quiet. I didn't remember grabbing my keys. I didn't remember choosing a direction. I only knew I needed distance, enough of it to breathe without feeling the weight of the house pressing against my ribs. I drove toward the one place where I knew my presence wouldn't feel like an intrusion. Tyler Briggs and Nina Briggs had offered support countless times over the years, but I had always kept them at arm's length, convinced I shouldn't bring my family's heaviness into their lives. That night, I had no energy left for restraint. When Tyler opened the door, the concern in his expression surfaced instantly, though he didn't ask questions. Nina stepped aside, allowing me to enter without hesitation. The warmth in their home felt almost unreal after the strained atmosphere I had left behind. While they moved around the living room, adjusting blankets and dimming lights, I tried to steady myself enough to form coherent thoughts. My mind churned through years of responsibility I had accepted without pause. Somewhere along the way, I had become the invisible scaffolding holding everything together, and the realization left me feeling hollow. The exhaustion I had ignored for so long washed over me, making the room tilt slightly. Tyler noticed, guiding me toward the couch with quiet understanding. His presence grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. The following morning, daylight pressed through the blinds with a clarity I wasn't prepared for. My phone lay on the coffee table, its screen lit by a flood of notifications. I stared at the number, 38 missed calls from family, and felt a sensation I couldn't name. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was the slow recognition that stepping away had created a disruption more powerful than any argument I could have initiated. Nina set a mug of coffee beside me before settling into the armchair across the room. Her kindness wasn't intrusive, it simply existed, steady and unobtrusive. I felt a flicker of relief, something I hadn't experienced in longer than I cared to admit. In that stillness, I finally allowed myself to examine the truth I had ignored. The financial structure of my family's life had become entirely dependent on me. I pulled my laptop onto my knees, the familiar weight strangely grounding. Logging into my accounts revealed a neatly stacked history of payments, utilities, insurance, property taxes, subscriptions. Each transaction a reminder of the years I had silently absorbed every responsibility. Seeing them gathered in one place shifted something inside me. The total wasn't as shocking as the realization that none of it had ever been acknowledged. The money had disappeared into the household as though it were inevitable, expected, a stable resource requiring no gratitude or recognition. The decision formed quietly, without dramatic flourish. If the household needed me so little emotionally, then it was time to remove myself practically as well. I opened the section where all the automatic payments lived, each one configured to renew without question, and hovered over the first line item. My fingers didn't tremble. Instead, a deep calm settled over me, a certainty that felt unlike anything I had allowed myself to embrace before. One by one, I began shutting down the financial channels that connected me to the house: electricity, water, internet, insurance. Each cancellation felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had given away too easily. The final confirmation prompted me to review my choice, but I didn't hesitate. A quiet click ended years of unspoken obligation. When I closed the laptop, the silence inside me felt different. Not empty, but steady. Quiet in a way that didn't demand explanation or apology. Tyler walked into the room at that moment, pausing as if sensing the shift. I didn't need to explain what I had done. The resolution in my posture must have revealed everything. Nina joined us, and the ease of their presence allowed me to sit still long enough to process the unfamiliar calm settling through my chest. The next steps weren't clear to me yet, but for the first time in years, the path forward wasn't dictated by anyone else's needs. I had made one decisive choice, and the consequences, whatever they would be, finally belonged to me. The first signs of fallout surfaced faster than I expected. It began with a vibration against the coffee table, my phone lighting up with a familiar name: Kelly Wallace. I didn't reach for it immediately. I wasn't ready to invite her turmoil into the calm I was barely beginning to assemble. When the ringing finally stopped, a text appeared, followed by another, each one sharper than the last. I didn't open them. I already knew the tone she used when she felt inconvenienced. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the sound cut through the room with a particular urgency, and I felt a shift in my chest. I let it ring out before turning the device face down. Tyler glanced up from the kitchen but didn't comment. His restraint felt like a kindness I hadn't known I needed. Another call came not long after, and this time curiosity outweighed hesitation. I answered, lifting the phone slowly to my ear. Kelly's voice surged through, pitched with frustration I recognized instantly. She didn't ask where I was. She didn't ask why I had left. Instead, she launched into a rapid stream of complaints about work she couldn't submit, deadlines slipping from her control, connections failing at the worst possible time. Beneath her irritation, there was an unmistakable threat of panic. I listened without responding. Her words moved quickly, tumbling into each other, fueled by the urgency of someone unaccustomed to setbacks that couldn't be pushed onto someone else. When she paused long enough for silence to gather between us, I felt a clarity settle in. She wasn't calling because she missed me. She was calling because the structure she relied on had shifted, and she didn't know how to stand without it. I ended the call before she could regain momentum. The moment the screen dimmed, a strange stillness formed around me. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply done absorbing what no one else had ever acknowledged. Later that day, my phone lit again, this time with the name Susan Wallace. I nearly let it ring, but something in me insisted on hearing her voice. When I answered, the tone was nothing like Kelly's. It carried softness wrapped in unease, a mix of concern and bewilderment. She spoke carefully, dancing around questions she didn't want the answers to. Her words circled the disruption at the house, the sudden inconvenience, the confusion over disconnected services. I didn't offer explanations. Her pauses were long enough for me to feel them settling between us like dust. When we hung up, the distance between our worlds felt wider than it had ever been. That evening, a message from Paula King appeared on my phone, a short inquiry, politely worded about whether everything at home was all right. She didn't offer details, but the subtext was clear. Neighbors had begun to notice the shift. Their observations had always lingered just outside the edges of our household, but now the imbalance that had long existed inside those walls was visible to the people beyond them. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to open the door to anyone else's curiosity, even when offered gently. The following afternoon brought my mother to the doorstep of the Briggs home. When Tyler opened the door, I could see from across the room that she carried the weight of unsettled days. Her steps were hesitant, her expression threaded with worry she couldn't disguise. She glanced around as if searching for a version of me she had misplaced. When she finally sat, the strain in her posture made it clear she hadn't come to reprimand me. Instead, she spoke about the mortgage falling behind again, the house feeling precarious, the responsibilities nobody knew how to manage. Her voice wavered in places, betraying the fear she was trying to soften. I watched her closely, absorbing the details she shared and the ones she avoided. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reassure her. I only listened, truly listened, to the consequences unfolding in the absence of a support system they had mistaken for endless. Their dependence had been so deeply woven into the fabric of the household that removing it left threads unraveling faster than they could gather them. After she left, the house grew quiet again. I remained on the couch, allowing the silence to settle around me without resistance. There was no satisfaction in witnessing their struggle. There was only the unmistakable awareness that everything built on unspoken expectations was finally being exposed for what it had always been. The days that followed unfolded in a way that revealed how fragile the foundation of their lives had been. It began with a letter addressed to the household, delivered in the kind of envelope no one wants to open. Thick paper, heavy ink, the markings of a lender losing patience. I didn't see the letter myself, but I heard about it soon enough through a message left on my phone. I didn't answer. I didn't need more details to understand what it meant. The house had been drifting toward instability for a long time. Without steady payments, the mortgage crept back into dangerous territory, and interest accumulated like dust in neglected corners. Susan Wallace didn't say the words directly, but the strain in her silence revealed everything. The possibility of losing the place she had lived in for decades loomed over her, and she didn't know how to confront it. Kelly Wallace, meanwhile, faced consequences of her own. The work she depended on began slipping from her grasp. Without stable internet, she missed deadlines, lost clients, and watched opportunities disappear faster than she could replace them. Eventually, she accepted a position stocking shelves during late-night hours at a supermarket on the edge of town. The work was steady but physically demanding, the kind of job she once dismissed as something she would never need to consider. Now it became her only option. My father, Harold Wallace, attempted to take on small repair jobs again, hoping to offset the growing financial pressure. But without reliable ways to communicate with customers, requests dwindled. His tools stayed lined up neatly in the garage, unused more often than not. He had always found comfort in fixing things, yet the problems now facing the household were beyond his reach. As their lives contracted under the weight of obligations they had long ignored, mine began to expand in ways I didn't anticipate. With the help of Victor Malone, an acquaintance from my years running the bookkeeping company, I secured a consulting position with a florist chain looking to reorganize its finances. The contract wasn't glamorous, but it came with stability, flexibility, and a salary that allowed me to breathe without calculating every expense. For the first time since leaving Seattle, I felt myself stepping into a version of my life that belonged entirely to me. I rented a small apartment in Denver, a modest one-bedroom with plain walls and sunlight that crept across the floor in the mornings. The space felt sparse at first, unfamiliar in its simplicity. But the quiet suited me. I furnished the rooms slowly, choosing pieces one at a time, allowing myself to appreciate the process instead of rushing toward completion. Each item felt like a quiet affirmation that I was building something separate from the burdens I had carried for so long. I organized my finances with the precision I had once used for clients, setting clear boundaries around what I earned and how I spent it. My savings no longer bled into obligations that weren't mine. Every dollar had a purpose, and every purpose aligned with my goals instead of someone else's survival. The shift was subtle at first, but each month reinforced the feeling that I was finally living with intention. Meanwhile, the situation in Colorado Springs deteriorated steadily. Notices from the lender grew more urgent. Neighbors began whispering about the family that had once been a fixture in the community, but now struggled visibly. Paula King didn't reach out again, but her silence spoke with the same curiosity that hovered at the edges of the neighborhood. Word traveled easily there, especially when it concerned decline rather than success. Eventually, the house had to be sold. There wasn't enough income to keep it afloat, and the debts had stacked too high for recovery. I learned about the sale through scattered updates shared by people who didn't know the full story, but knew enough to repeat what they had heard. It wasn't difficult to imagine the scene: the for sale sign planted in the front yard, the lawn untrimmed, the windows dim. I didn't drive by to see it for myself. Some endings didn't require witness. After the sale, my family relocated to a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a compressed space that forced them into proximity they weren't used to. I didn't check on them, though fragments of information still drifted toward me from time to time. Kelly continued working nights. My father took on what odd jobs he could find. My mother adapted with quiet resignation, learning to live within limits she had never acknowledged before. In my own world, the days unfolded with a steady rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and liberating. I no longer waited for crises. I no longer shaped my life around the expectations of others. The freedom was not loud or triumphant. It was simply steady, something I could lean into without fear of it disappearing. With time moving steadily forward, the distance between my old life and the one I was building widened in ways I hadn't anticipated. I no longer waited for updates, yet they continued to surface, drifting toward me through people who meant well or simply happened to know more than they realized. I accepted the information without seeking more. The space I had created felt necessary, even when the past attempted to fold itself back into view. One afternoon, after returning from a meeting with the florist chain, I found an envelope slipped beneath my apartment door. My name appeared in handwriting I recognized instantly: Kelly Wallace. For a moment, I simply looked at it, letting the weight of the gesture settle before opening it. The paper crackled softly as I unfolded it, revealing a letter far longer than I expected. Kelly's words moved unevenly across the page, a mixture of apology and justification. She wrote about pressure, exhaustion, and the fear of losing everything she thought she could depend on. She admitted to speaking harshly, though she framed her outburst as a moment of stress rather than a reflection of how she truly saw me. She mentioned the nights at her supermarket job, the strain of adjusting to a life she had never imagined for herself, and the frustration of feeling unprepared for responsibilities she once believed she wouldn't have to carry. Yet for all the vulnerability woven through her sentences, something remained missing. The letter skirted around accountability, touching the edges of awareness without stepping fully into it. She acknowledged the impact of her words, but didn't seem to grasp the deeper truth behind why I had finally walked away. A few days later, another message arrived, this time from Susan Wallace. Her tone carried a blend of longing and confusion, mixed with subtle disappointment. She spoke of family ties, of forgiveness, of how she wished things hadn't unraveled in the way they had. But like Kelly, she stopped short of examining the patterns that had allowed so much imbalance to take root. Her message held emotion, but not understanding. I read both messages carefully, letting the silence of my apartment act as a buffer between their expectations and my reality. I didn't feel anger. The sharpness of that emotion had faded long ago. What remained was clarity, an understanding that some distances are not created out of spite, but out of necessity. I placed the letter from Kelly in a drawer, not as an act of preservation, but simply because I didn't know what else to do with it. The message from my mother stayed unread beyond its first view. I didn't respond to either. I recognized that engaging would only pull me back toward a version of myself I had worked hard to leave behind. Over the following months, the quiet in my life became something I learned to appreciate deeply. I invested more energy into my consulting work, taking on new clients introduced by Victor Malone, and shaping a career defined on my terms rather than out of obligation. I reconnected with small pleasures: long walks, weekend markets, evenings spent without the weight of unspoken expectations. The simplicity of those moments grounded me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. My family continued navigating their new circumstances. I heard, indirectly, that they adjusted to apartment living, though not without challenges. Kelly kept her job. My father found occasional repair work. My mother adapted to a life that required restraint and budgeting. None of it brought me satisfaction or bitterness. It simply existed as part of the reality that comes when dependency is no longer invisible. The life I had now wasn't extraordinary, but it was fully mine, built from choices made consciously rather than from fear of what might happen if I stepped away. I no longer saw myself as the quiet backbone of a household unable to stand without me. I was simply a person learning to live with dignity, boundaries, and intention. In the quiet moments, I often reflected on how easily sacrifice can turn into expectation, and how expectation can disguise itself as belonging. It took me years to understand that giving endlessly does not guarantee appreciation, and staying out of loyalty does not guarantee love. Sometimes the most compassionate act is stepping away, not to punish, but to protect what remains of yourself. If my story holds any weight, let it be this: you cannot save people who refuse to see the cost of your saving, and you are not obligated to break yourself so others can stand more comfortably. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what part of this journey stayed with you the most? I genuinely appreciate hearing how these stories resonate across different lives and places.